Welcome, everyone, to our, what is this? The number, is it seventh?
Seventh,
just an hour of the semester. So we're excited again to keep going after a week off. Just an hour went on fall break last week, but we're back, I think, with a really great provocative topic. Crisis breeds innovation. A discussion about research in K12 realities post-COVID. Before we start, as usual, we'll just have a few announcements. One, just a reminder, everyone should have received a message about, from Punya and I, about the data policy survey. So we're really encouraging all faculty members, all doctoral students. Actually, I don't know, they got the survey as well.
yes, I had asked that to be forwarded to all the PhD and EDD students.
Right. So encourage others to complete it. There's some really significant changes in university policy related to the management and storage of data for all research projects done by faculty and students affiliated with the university. Punya's been able to recruit folks from Knowledge Enterprise, where the policy originated, to speak with us. They'll be speaking at an upcoming Just an Hour session in 2 weeks on November 4th. So we'll send out the link. Actually, if you could post the link to the survey in chat, maybe.
Got it.
Yeah, so just so you have it in case you've lost that email.
Actually, Betty, if I can just add one thing here. I don't know, Travis, Stephen, whether you guys received this or not. Please copy and paste that link. Since you're now a part of ASU, this is going to impact the work that you do as well. So I think it's really important that you guys look at this policy, fill out that survey, and possibly join the Just an Hour on November 4th. Somebody from your team should be here. I think this policy can have impact at various levels on all the research that we do. Remind me, if I don't send you an email after this session, remind me, and Steve, drop me a note and I will do that. I think that's important for you guys to look at as well.
Great point, Punya. Yeah, thanks for adding that. A few other announcements, please. Those of you who use Twitter, follow at ASU Education, all one word. We're really working on increasing the college presence and in particular sharing faculty work there. So please follow and please continue to share your work with us. One celebratory announcement, a silver lining for learning. And actually, again, could we get the website into the chat? That Punya is a lead collaborator on, is going to receive the 2022 AECT Distinguished Development Award at the AECT conference coming up in Las Vegas this week. So we're really excited about that. Congratulations, Punya, and the rest of the team. Let's see. Okay, and just again, a reminder, please continue to complete the new monthly scholarship survey. It's going to be coming out soon. I don't know exactly when, Clarin, if you know, but please take a few minutes to complete it. It again helps us stay informed about everything that you're doing and gives us an opportunity then to share that information both internally and externally. A couple more announcements before we get started. Next week, October 28th, we brought together a group of journal editors, faculty within the college who are editing major journals, and we're going to involve them in a conversation about current issues related to publication. We had a similar session last year that was really interesting, so hopefully you can join us for that. Already mentioned November 4th, we're going to devote that session to the new data storage policy. November 11th, Veterans Day. So that's a ASU holiday, no Just an Hour that week. And our last Just an Hour on November 18th, we'll be celebrating Global Education Week, and that will be led by the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College Office of Global Engagement. So stay tuned. Hope those are all on your calendar. And with that, Punya, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the session today.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you for the shout out for Silver Lining. For those who don't know, back in March of 2020, we started this informal conversation every Saturday, and it's been going on for 2.5 years now with 126 episodes. And it's been an amazing, it's a zero funded project. It's just 4 of us get together on Zoom. We invite people from across the world who have joined us. In fact, Serpi, who are talking to us today, is going to be one of the guests coming up in an episode in December, I think. So with that, welcome to Travis Willow and Stephen Weiner for joining us today. Travis is Innovation Fellow and Senior Writer at Center for Reinventing Public Education, brings a background in journalism and educational policy. Stephen Weiner was a doc student in my class, tried to get away from ASU, moved to the state of Washington, joined SERPI, and then SERPI became a part of ASU. So there's no way he can escape ASU. He received the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, has been a University Innovation Fellow at the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. Now, SERPI, as all of you may know, is now a part of ASU. And so we are so happy and proud of that because they conduct research at a very high level on classroom, schools, and systems to identify systemic barriers to equity and excellence. Since March 2020, and I think that's going to be a part of the focus of this conversation, they really have been the go-to source for high quality research about threats to student success and equity posed by COVID-19. As you know, SERPI became a part of MLFTC back in February of this year, and just since then have received over $1 million in grants to continue and support the work. So we're very excited to have them be part of the college and for them to join us today. A couple of the recent reports that they've had have been around the state of the student and pandemic recovery, their work on learning pods. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump in and ask Travis and Stephen to introduce themselves, how they got to this place, and then maybe we'll kick off with some key things that they want to share with us, and then just open the conversation up. So with that, Travis.
Well, Punya, thank you for that introduction, and it's great to be here with you all. And it's great to have this opportunity to connect with folks across the college. I guess for me, I actually started my career as a State House reporter in Tallahassee, Florida. Florida, as some of you all know, is what they call a good news state, which basically means it's one of the, it's a crazy place, never a dull moment. And education in Florida is always one of the hottest and most interesting issues. And I always appreciated one of my go-to sources actually from those days was on the call. Professor Dorn actually helped make sense of some of the controversies around Florida's school accountability system. So as you can see, the Florida to Arizona pipeline flows one way. But so after that, I made the jump into actually working in school choice in Florida and working with the nonprofit that administered our ESA program for students with disabilities. And it was there that I became obsessed with the challenge that really has shaped the work that I do here at SERPI, which is, what does it look like to take some of the innovation, the individualization that those programs enable, and learn lessons from that we can apply to the public education system as a whole? What does it look like to take to explore and study some of these more outside the system innovations and learn lessons about how public education can serve all students better? And so that's really where a lot of my work at SERPI is focused.
Thank you, Travis. Stephen?
Yeah, this is great. And it's always nice to hear the stories of other SERPI members because there's a lot of echoes. But so, yes, Punya, you've mentioned that we now go back a few years. So you've heard my story a few times, but for those of you who don't know me, and it's kind of interesting because I am in fact a PhD student at Arizona State University for hopefully no more than the next few weeks as I prepare to defend my dissertation. My career in education actually started in Arizona. Before I moved up to the Pacific Northwest a few years ago, I was a teacher. I taught in charter schools. For those of you who all probably aware, I taught with Great Hearts. And Arizona, like Florida, is a little bit like even more the Wild West. And I had really fascinating experiences being part of a kind of traditional but innovative school system. I saw the good, the bad, the ugly. But mostly what I saw was that the systems that are kind of undergirding the regular high school experience, the standardized tests, the scholarship-based grades, the way that students perceive of high school as being basically just their opportunity to save money and make it to college and find sort of like the next rung in the educational system. It really got me down because as a physics teacher, I just really wanted my students to enjoy the learning experiences. I wanted them to be in it for the reasons that I think all of us want students to be in the school system. And so I pushed and pushed on the system to instigate like a standards-oriented grading, a mastery-based system in my class. I wanted to do things hands-on, and I got about as far as I could before my principal basically said, what you're doing is great, but you still need to give grades. And at that point, I said, okay, I've hit a wall. And so I jumped out of the system. I'm using Travis's language here. And I worked for a few years at Arizona Science Center to help them start their makerspace, which was a really fascinating and amazing experience. But in both cases, I kind of felt the barriers of the system, and that propelled me back to school, because I think the question that now drives me every day is, why is it that systems that want to innovate, that have people in them who are interested in changing, can't change? Even when they throw money at the problem, even when they write vision statements and mission statements and principles that are all about innovation. Maybe even, I'm not pointing fingers, but even maybe when they put innovation on the side of a bus or a light rail, and yet there are there are maybe challenges to changing systems that go beyond that. So that has driven me to, and I'm very, very fortunately to be a researcher, an analyst here at SERPI, and study these things, both from looking at systems that are doing things differently, districts that are doing things differently, but then also looking outside and figuring out, in both cases, how can we change the way people think about innovation, think about implementing innovative solutions, and also just pushing on ideas of like scaling and adoption and implementation, thinking about policy as well. So I could go on, but I think that maybe is a good place.
Thank you, Steve. So just to kick us off, since our title is Crisis Breeds Innovation, so wondering if you could speak a little bit about sort of the work that SERPI has been doing, looking at how school systems responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. What were some sort of innovations or changes that you saw that are worthwhile for us to continue with, and others which maybe we shouldn't have to be dealing with. So I'm just going to leave it open to either of you to speak to sort of what did you learn about sort of students' needs and systemic challenges during the pandemic? And either of you can jump in first and just take it from there.
Sure. So I think one thing that's kind of a problem inherent in both the title of this session and a lot of our work is the idea that crisis often does not breed innovation. A lot of times when people are in crisis or they're under stress, the tendency is to do what you know and just do it harder and faster. And actually, what does it look like to create the conditions in public education for innovation to take hold and to thrive is a serious challenge that we've confronted in this work. So I think one thing that we did was, so at SERPI, with a lot of our colleagues being based in Seattle, they kind of had an early window into going back to February 2020, how the pandemic was beginning to disrupt public education. Schools were beginning to shut down. Some of the very first cases were in Washington State, and some of the very first school districts in America to close their doors were in Washington State. And that kind of helped us maybe be a few weeks ahead of everyone else in terms of, we're going to really pivot our operations and go all in on trying to understand what impact the pandemic is going to have on the ability to keep students learning, and what kind of stresses it's going to put on the system, and what kind of just this is going to be a pressure point. What changes are going to result from that? And so at first we were focused on, and so I guess one big sort of takeaway from our work over the past 3 years is that at every stage of the crisis, we saw our school districts were sort of caught flat-footed, in the sense that first they were slow to see the crisis coming onto our shores, slow to adopt and shift to remote learning. Then kind of for the next 2 years, really hamstrung by the assumption that there would be a return to normal just around the corner. And then a new wave of the virus would come, and it turns out that we're shut down again. It turns out our reopening plan is disrupted. Last school year, we're back in school, but now we're struggling to staff our classrooms. And so we've been chronicling how the pandemic has just sort of created this continual drumbeat of disruption that we know has affected students' academic learning. It has affected their social and emotional well-being, and that some of the students who have been most profoundly impacted have been those like students with disabilities, who oftentimes our schools just struggle to serve well in the best of times. But at the same time, I think we've seen that the pandemic's impact were not that discontinuous from a lot of the challenges that existed before the pandemic. And so a lot of the challenges that have been exacerbated by all of these disruptions are things like the gaps between the highest achieving students and the lowest achieving students are growing wider. The mental health challenges that create a barrier to learning for many of our young people were already getting worse before the pandemic. And schools were struggling to individualize and meet the needs of kind of students with complex needs, or at the tails of different distributions, before the pandemic. So where we've seen innovations arise, have come in surprising places. There's been schools all over the country that have found new ways to include, the voices of parents in a lot of their decision making. There were a lot of students with disabilities who maybe had experience of grade level instruction for the first time, where remote learning kind of leveled the playing field in a surprise way. We've seen students who experienced sort of things like bullying or racism in their schools that they intended previously, where they kind of got a pause and a respite. And so now what we're trying to figure out is, what does it look like to take those lessons and apply them into the system going forward? But also, where a lot of my interest and a lot of my work lies is also on the question of, there were a lot of interesting innovations that arose outside of the public education system. And so that's one reason why we made a choice to study learning pods, is we wanted to really understand, when families, communities are left to their own devices, what kind of learning solutions do they create? And we saw a lot of interesting potential there around how, in particular, teachers felt they were able to be more responsive to the needs of their students when they ran their own learning environment from soup to nuts, but that they also struggled with a lot of things like isolation, and feeling like they didn't have abilities to collaborate with professional colleagues. And so I think it does raise a question of, as we look to build changes into public education system as a whole, how do we give teachers the flexibility to respond to their students' needs, without creating these dynamics where people feel isolated, they feel like they're working on an island. So those are some of the challenges that we're digging into. Stephen, I think, has been focused a lot on, he's gotten on the ground on a couple of interesting innovation efforts in Colorado, and also is going to be leading some of our new work looking at innovation in the teacher workforce. So I'm sure he has more to say.
Yeah, and I'll just add real quick onto that, Travis, because I think Travis started by saying that, did crisis breed innovation broadly? Possibly not. It maybe bred kind of it bred sort of an ambiguity, where people were on one hand saying, like, now's the time to reimagine school, now's the time to redesign school. But those were like just some voices, right? That was just some small subset of the voices. It did become more mainstream maybe than it had been to have these conversations, to sort of rethink assumptions, but the pull to go back to normal has been very strong. I think we've seen that on the ground. I will point out one kind of interesting outside of the system place that we looked, and I don't know if this is like maybe a huge topic to bring up here, which is the learning pods and these sort of organic ad hoc learning communities that were very small, that formed during the height of the pandemic. Most of them have since kind of peaked and disbanded as schools reopened. But a little bit of our work during that time, a lot of our work focused on learning pods and what their value was, both to both sort of the organic versions, but then as well as looking at like districts that started their own pods, or other organizations that actually started these small group quasi-informal learning communities. And it is interesting to see what educators, what people who were teachers who left school, who ended up like leading these pods, their sense of autonomy, their sense of joy, their sense of ownership and relationship forming between parents and students. All of these things actually were, they were bright spots, they were silver linings to the pandemic. And I think that it's worth pointing them out. There are huge issues with looking to learning pods as like a solution. And maybe this is something you all have talked about before. I think it's likely came up probably like a year or so ago. But it was interesting to look at them, and then for us to keep the sort of extract from those experiences and say, well, what does this teach us about the system going forward? What can we possibly retain and not lose, because everyone is going back now. Everyone is back, right?
Right. So thank you for that. And if I can just drop a couple of thoughts here just to follow up, because one of the things, because we've been doing the silver lining for learning, we've had a chance to talk to, particularly at the beginning and the middle of the pandemic, with people, with leaders, school leaders who are responding to it. And two examples that really come to mind, and I think these are like huge shout outs to MLFTC, honestly. So one is Sean Lesher, who is a grad of our EDD program, got the AERA award for best dissertation. He was heading the San Diego, I'm forgetting the name of the school system that he was leading. And when he was a guest on Silver Lining, one of the things that really stood out was how sort of the overall values that you bring to the work of leadership do, because their approach was really, let's not talk about the ones who already have access, let's start with the ones who don't. So those who need a computer at home, those who have second language needs, those who have special needs, and work from there. And the other example that I give is of the Spark School here, which MLFTC was sort of involved in designing from bottom up. When we spoke to the educator designer there, one of the things he said is that they actually pushed back against the school district's approach. So the school district had said, we will have teachers create videos, master teachers who were sort of described as being good teachers, and the other teachers would act as sort of an assistive way. What the Spark School educator said, that we have built this relationship with our community, with the parents, that this would actually be a disruption, so we can actually handle it better. And so the thing that I take away from that is those organizations which had certain core values sort of responded to it better, and systems that had already been organically integrated with the community actually handled it better. So it sort of, again, builds on what you were saying. There are a couple of questions here. I'm saying, Sherman, do you want to, instead of my reading out the question, you're reading it out?
Oh, and Travis has sort of responded a bit to that. I'm wondering where K12 public school districts have done fairly well comparatively. There are lots of areas in which I think we can start to do a postmortem, but in some areas they did fairly well. I think free and reduced lunch services, free and reduced meal programs, after a couple of weeks they did pretty well, much better than academic services. And so I was sort of wondering if there's anything that we can learn from who did well within the bounds of local school districts.
So I would say, in addition to what I mentioned in the chat, I think one thing in terms of who did well that also kind of builds on Punya's point is that the schools that I think there was a kind of a rediscovering of the importance of relationships and how much relationships matter. And so the schools that had strong relationships with the communities that they served, a lot of times, like for example, one of our sort of on the ground qualitative studies was of Chicago public schools. And what we saw there was that like their community schools that had staff that was sort of dedicated to reaching out to families and had that sort of go-to contact point really made an impact on their ability to keep students engaged in learning and in the early days of the pandemic. And I think there's like a renewed appreciation for the importance of those relationships and how that relates to core academic learning. I think another thing that kind of remains relevant, unfortunately, as we see chronic absenteeism remain elevated in school systems across the country, is that we did have some districts like Miami-Dade that really invested in sending adults out into the community to try to identify who, if students are not showing up in their online classes, if they're not showing up in school, let's send someone to their house. Let's do a house call. Let's find out what's going on in their life, what's happening that's keeping them out of school. Sometimes they found that student had left and they were attending a different learning option, or they moved away. But other times there was some sort of barrier to learning that then the district could then troubleshoot. And so I think a lot of and I think that feeds into the larger takeaway that the idea of having these systems to kind of reach out to families and investing in relationships really does seem to pay off. I think another sort of a lot of the other strengths that we've seen from school districts relate to, Sherman's initial point about food distribution is a good one. I think that districts overall have shouldered more responsibility over the course of the pandemic, and we've seen just a ratcheting up of the number of things on district leaders' plates. And so meal distribution was one. I think the fact that they're now sort of broadband providers of last resort is another. I think that the expansion of mental health services is something that a lot of public schools have taken on. And I think, another example would be just like they're operating more tutoring initiatives or SEL and sort of support services for students. And so the amount of just services that districts are providing and the number of things on leaders' plates has sort of ratcheted up. That's a testament in some ways to what districts are doing. I think it also raises a question of what other institutions should maybe be stepping up to take on some of these functions and ensure that students get the services they need.
Yeah, and then I think this won't come as any surprise to Travis. I'm thinking of at least one district that we saw that was, we think of like if the question is, does crisis breed innovation? We saw districts that were already innovating respond particularly well, or at least better. I'm thinking of Edgecombe County in North Carolina. That's a district that had been working with the most under-resourced, underserved schools, created an innovation zone. They had already sort of flexed like an innovation muscle, and we're starting to build out an infrastructure to try out different things, to test different kinds of programs. I think they had a micro school before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, and it seemed that of all, like in comparison to other districts, granted they're small, they're also rural, relatively rural, they also were particularly able to test out new learning pods or kind of micro school communities faster than other districts were. So I think that's at least another kind of thing to keep in mind. It's like school districts that are already willing to do things differently. When a crisis happens, they're willing to do things differently then as well, and they're more prepared to do that. Then the last thing I'll say is there's another set of districts in Colorado, which Travis alluded to, which were in the middle of a change program around CTE. It started in 2019. This is 8 rural districts. It was a program called the Homegrown Talent Initiative. And to Punya's point around having sort of like a strong set of values, the districts actually persisted in their change project. It was a 3-year program. And a lot of the superintendents, a lot of the leaders in the district will actually say, because we had this program, which was getting us to reflect on our values, to develop like a community-based portrait of a graduate that was specifically relevant for their communities, that actually helped them through the pandemic. That actually helped them navigate and orient themselves. So is sort of another interesting kind of example of, it would, in some cases, you would think that that actually would be the first thing to go during an emergency. And it actually, for a lot of the districts, it actually kept them grounded in thinking differently in general about their work, and it helped them get through the pandemic.
Thank you. I just put a link to this episode about Oakland, California on silver lining. And that was a very inspiring episode, really, because it was an example of sort of public schools working with civic and non-for-profit and government to actually reach the digital divide. And at a time when you see these organizations often at sort of loggerheads with each other in a political space or whatever, that was really a very good example, I think, of how this can be done, that can happen differently. I'm just curious if anybody else has questions. I know we have some questions in here, but I would love to get as many voices into this as possible. Okay. Always hard to get faculty to talk. I don't know why that is. With that, so let's go to let's look at this question here that we sort of talked about, we discussed. So you've largely, SERP's focused largely on systems level challenges and innovations. And I think systems are things which are very hard for sort of people to understand, like what a system is, because it's usually quite invisible to what it is. So can you speak a little bit about how SERP sort of talks or thinks about how you work with systems, and maybe any current or upcoming projects which directly address that sort of systemic change that you're interested in doing?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things here. So one is that one landmark SERP report that I think we keep coming back to is one we did. I think it was about 2017 on personalized learning, and really looking at the fact that personalized learning was something that caught a lot of attention around the country, got a lot of attention from grant makers, got a lot of enthusiasm from educators. And a lot of times when we studied how these initiatives would play out on the ground, one thing that we saw was that you would get a lot of enthusiasm from teachers. You might get some enthusiasm from school leaders or from district leaders around, I'm finally finding a new way to be more responsive to my students' needs. This is the way I always wanted to teach. We're doing more projects, learning feels less rote. A lot of that kind of excitement would build up, and then things would start to happen where it's like maybe we've got one classroom within the school where really cool things are happening, but it doesn't spread beyond that. We've got one school that has shifted to a project-based model, but then the changes sort of stop there. And so part of what we're interested in is creating these system conditions where an initiative that generates a lot of enthusiasm at the teacher level or at the school leader level can actually spread and impact everyone who's interested. I think another thing that we're interested in a project that I'm going to be focusing on in the coming months is looking at what we're calling community-led innovation. And so this is in some ways building upon our look at pandemic learning pods, where during the pandemic, we saw a new, I would say, awakening of community organizations like the Boston Community Learning Collaborative or the Oakland Reach. These organizations that often existed to serve parents or families in their communities, or help them navigate, maybe advocate for change or advocate for their individual children, that then created new learning environments during the pandemic. And a lot of times those environments would be a little bit different from a traditional school. Maybe we had more adults working in those environments that share the background and life experience of our students. Maybe we're able to do different kinds of activities in those learning environments that are different from what we do during the normal school day, and students are responding to that. And so I think there's a question of, there's this, and then, in also some learning pods, they were created by families. And so there's this question of, when families and communities create these new types of learning environments, what kind of things do they do differently? What are they solving for? And what lessons can we learn from that can then inform changes in public education as a whole? And I think that one of the unique sort of lenses that we want to bring to the rise of like micro schools or the proliferation of new homeschool collaboratives is that we don't just want to cheerlead the creation of these opportunities. We don't just want to talk about these things for their own sake, but we want to think about what lessons do these hold for ultimately public education as a whole. What insights can we draw that will ultimately benefit all students and not just a few who happen to be participating in
Thank you, Travis. So there's a great question from Amy. So Amy, I'll have you ask that question, but I just want to, before that, preface that, because one of the issues I feel is that there is a sense of privilege that comes, that you can create a learning pod, that you have enough laptops or devices to go around with the family, that you have enough spaces in your rooms. When we are looking at the use of surveillance software like Proctorio, where, and so on. So Amy, why don't you ask your question? Because I think that sort of gets to the heart of some of the concerns that I've had with some of these innovations.
Okay. So yeah, as I'm listening, I think it sounds amazing, and I wish that it could happen in all of our schools, but I'm wondering, like, do these environments meet the needs of the students with exceptionalities? So disabilities, lack of resources, any of those things. And then how are these used as wraparound services or just wraparound lessons that I'm thinking it'd be amazing to have something that's in the community that then follows into the classroom. And so we have really functional learning for all of our students instead of just like, filling in the bubbles and answering the questions.
Yeah, so I want to say a couple things about that. First of all, students with exceptionalities or learning differences are a huge priority for us at SERPI, in no small part because some of our leadership are in fact parents of students with disabilities and are really passionate about it. We also think that a lot of lessons for system change can be drawn from the experience of students at the tails, students who are exceptional in all sorts of different ways. So looking at learning pods, we use that as kind of an umbrella term that describes a number of different things. So for example, the Boston Community Learning Collaborative, their pods were explicitly created by a community group with a mission-driven orientation to serve Black and Latino children from low-income families. And so that was a different experience from like a lot of the parent-created learning pods where, we did survey some of these parents and get some income data. And, I think a lot of what Punya was saying is absolutely borne out by our study, that those types of experiences tended to be confined to more affluent and privileged families. So that was kind of that. There is a divide in terms of the types of learning environments that maybe different students have access to. In terms of exceptionalities and the experience of students in some of these spaces, we saw that the small group size, the flexibility and the customization benefited a lot of students with, at least like on an anecdotal level, who had learning disabilities or who had maybe mild to moderate exceptionalities, where they were able to, their teachers were more able to sort of tailor things to their needs. And we heard from a lot of parents that like, wow, this has been transformational in terms of the progress that my child has been able to make. I think with some of the more severe exceptionalities or some of the students who required more special accommodations, one of the biggest challenges was that if you're in a learning environment that's outside of the school district, but the school district has typically been responsible for providing your special education services, suddenly now you're maybe cutting yourself off from those services. And so what does it look like to make those rights portable, make those services accessible, no matter what learning environment you're choosing, is something that I think is worth digging into. Because I think just much hinges upon whether there's actual equitable access to the support that students need. I think to your last point, some of the most intriguing learning pods that we've seen or innovative learning environments like micro schools and things like that are operated by like what I like to call the groups formerly known as out of school time, where maybe previously you ran a summer camp or an after school program, or maybe even there's one near my home in Florida run by the Brevard Zoo, where it's now like they operate a sort of a program for, they operate sort of a school-like program that caters to homeschoolers, where it's like, these are groups that were previously on the margins or supplemental, or maybe like what they offered to students in a typical school was like a field trip. And they kind of asked the question, why don't we make the whole school out of that? And then they've created this kind of innovative and more engaging learning environment. I think that's an intriguing pathway. And one reason that that's such an intriguing pathway is a lot of times the people in the out of school space, these are organizations that are community groups that have a lot of trust among a subset of families that they serve. A lot of the people working in those environments are more likely perhaps to match the background and the life experiences of low-income students. And so I think it does offer some intriguing possibilities in terms of what does it look like to create more integration between those efforts and the schools, and the potential benefits there for students.
Stephen, anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say on the question of when you talk about environments meeting the needs of students with exceptionalities, or maybe even more broadly, how do we serve everyone with, like, we know there are just like vast differences, vast cultural differences, socioeconomic differences. And so I think something that SERPI, maybe I'll just like leave the headline here, which is SERPI wants to take very seriously that there are groups, there are groups that may not ever kind of come across the radar to a district or to a school that may have huge value in helping serve certain communities. And I'll actually just point to one organization in particular that we've been working with for years, also in Colorado, is a group called Reschool. And Reschool has a mission of finding, making sure that learning happens everywhere and learning happens for every student. But the way they go about it, they work with districts, they work with schools, but their kind of current emphasis and the direction they're going now is to empower community-led groups that are already embedded in specific communities. Their focus is on low-income and minority communities, and then empowering those communities to fund students out of school learning. Oftentimes they are trying to provide funding for summer camp, summer experiences, but also just like basic supplies, tutoring, other kinds of resources that students who come from more well-resourced backgrounds, they have those things. But I think that it's just interesting to point out that this is an organization that is trying to empower the networks that already exist within communities and give them more agency and resources to help the people that they know need help. And I think it's worth saying, like, well, what can we learn from that? Like, what can districts learn from that? Just knowing that they don't know everyone and they may have like big blind spots when it comes to certain communities.
Thank you. So I'm going to, again, please feel free to jump in with your questions. So I have a slightly different question. I'll bring it up to collaborations that we are looking at within MLFTC. But very briefly, one of the challenges I have felt looking post-pandemic is the fact that everybody went online. And that has meant that a sort of a surveillance system has sort of gotten baked into our educational system now, where students can be tracked, their movements can be tracked. And I've mentioned Proctorio as an example, and ASU was guilty of using that. I used to have my daughter take these exams where she'd have to lock herself in a room, videotape the whole, I mean, it was just pathetic as an educational approach. So I'm just wondering about, and quickly, because I want to talk a little bit about, and Leanna has a question as well. And any experience with that in the work that you have done? Briefly, I want to get to Leanna's question and some more stuff. Travis or Stephen? No? Okay.
Sorry, is the question around sort of tracking and sort of how that plays out in online learning platforms?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you have seen like any concerns around that from people that you've worked with, districts around the country, or schools, or that has, even if it hasn't popped up, it hasn't. I mean, that's fine. That's something that's been bothering me a lot. So I was just curious.
It's not something that's directly come up from us, but I would say one issue that has come up with us is the challenge of the ed tech community and the education community. Their integration between those two is often lacking, and a lot of times the early decisions that are made in the design of like learning software are not necessarily tailored to the kind of actual needs of educators. And so there remains like a real challenge of, yes, we're generating now reams of data through these online learning platforms. Can we actually integrate those in a meaningful way that's providing, actionable insights to educators, to parents, to students? That remains kind of a missing target. And I think a lot of the challenge to that relates to the design processes in education technology.
Thank you. And I think Liana has a sort of question along the same line. So Liana, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I was just wondering about if you've done any work with teachers, and now that they've experienced emergency remote learning, which is different than online learning, like kind of planned and designed in advance. But are there models, is there more openness toward moving toward blended, and how teachers are? I know not all teachers had a great experience with emergency remote learning, but I think it potentially opened up some possibilities, like, what's possible here. But I was just wondering if there's any work about blended learning.
Well, so one interesting window we had into that was through our work on pods, where the vast majority of pods we studied were in some ways integrated or built on top of district or other public school operated online learning programs. And so the teachers would have to integrate and collaborate with those. One challenge was that a lot of times that handicapped their flexibility, where you had districts kind of trying to recreate the school day online. And so it's like, now I've got to do like this 6-period schedule in a living room. Like that's kind of defeats the purpose of all the flexibility that online learning is supposed to enable. But there were some experiences where teachers reported that basically like, I'm actually able to work in the way I want. And one interview that I gave with a teacher who was working in a learning pod at the time that haunts me was basically, she was saying, like, I'd actually been out of teaching for 18 months. And now I finally have a working environment where I'm able to bring my 2-year-old to work with me, and I'm able to actually work again. And my 2-year-old's just there, and I'm here teaching these kind of second graders. And, I've got a built-in sort of childcare solution. And 1 month after that interview, my daughter was born, and my wife left the classroom, and she has not yet returned because public education and parenting young children, a lot of times that really does not mix. And so I think that one hope that I have is that we're kind of confronting that issue much more head on than we were previously.
Yeah,
I'm going to. Oh, sorry, Stephen. No, go ahead. Finish your thought. Briefly.
Well, all I'm going to say, this is just another way of kind of reiterating what Travis said, which is we talked to a lot of teachers over the last year that were mostly involved in sort of our pods focused work, but then other teachers as well in kind of like other out of system environments that basically said, yes, of course, we're very open. We're very open to this kind of blended learning models. It feels in some ways like we could start to think about unbundling the people who are providing content and then the people who are really building relationships and helping students be like strategic learners who are in person. This is something I saw when looking at an organization, their name is KaiPod. And actually, I think they're opening up some centers in the Phoenix area, but they're a non-school system, right? So it's a for-profit organization, but there are people there now who are sort of, they call themselves learning coaches, and they're working with students who are online learners. And now they have this sort of auxiliary learning guide in person to help. And the teachers who are doing that work, the people I talked to, one of which was a former teacher, said, this is an amazing way of operating. But again, outside of like a big district or a school.
Thank you, Stephen. I think one of the things that Travis, you mentioned earlier about community groups and organizations moving into this space. I think, Stephen, you gave this example. I think one of the things that we are also seeing through the series that we've done is that those kinds of collaborations which didn't happen before, we're seeing a few more of those. I think that's a change that's happening. So Betty, I know you have a couple of questions or about SERPI and MLFTC. So I'm going to let you step in here.
Great. So I think there's just clearly a lot of potential overlap and synchronicity between the work that you all are doing and the work that many folks are doing here at our college. And I'd like to sort of end, as we're getting near the time limit for this session, on a discussion of some ways that faculty and doctoral students here could become more of a part of the work that you're doing. For example, the Learning Futures Collaborative. I don't know if the two of you are involved with that, on developing a research agenda for the new American high school, or other sorts of things. How can folks learn more? Who should they contact? What thoughts do you two have about that?
So the first thing is SERPI is a very flat organization where people are empowered to make a difference. So if you contact us, Stephen or I, and we'll put our contact information in the chat. We might not be the person to talk to, but we can absolutely put you in touch with the person who is. Another thing is I am in charge of our version of Just an Hour that's internal to SERPI. And so if you have research that you would like to share with our team, I'm the person to talk to about that, and we would love to kind of begin sort of a home and home, if you will, having some of you all share some of your work with us. So that's like an easy way to maybe have an initial conversation that could catalyze some specific collaborations. We're excited about the new American high school concept. That name obviously comes from drinking some ASU Kool-Aid that we're really excited to drink. But then I think the other thing is that I was recently I've been presenting to groups of legislators about some of our pandemic research. And one thing that I've done is just like flashed a slide or two about Brent's work on the next education workforce. And then suddenly, that seems to generate a lot of excitement. And so Stephen is helping to build out a portfolio about what it means to really reinvent the education workforce and create more opportunities for career advancement for teachers. But so I think that is one area where we're interested in growing a portfolio of work, and where we feel like the college as a producer of both talent and knowledge, where we could really stoke some collaboration. So yeah, we're just always, please feel free to reach out, and we'll be happy to collaborate. I don't know, Stephen, if there's any.
Well, I will just say you touched on the Learning Futures Collaborative, which I am a part of, and I'm helping lead that with Chelsea Waite here. We actually are just in the process right now of onboarding I forget what the official title is, but it's a grad student in Mary Lou Fulton, or it's a grad student, I think perhaps through Dr. Powers. And she's going to be helping on the Learning Futures Collaborative, the design of the new American high school. That's a wonderful opportunity. We're glad that the Learning Futures Collaboratives are happening, and would love to keep working with you all. We have a few meetings, I think, coming up, and one of which is going to be in person. And maybe this is also another time. I don't know if this is like the right time to plug the fact that we're actually going to be doing our own in-person SERPI retreat in Tempe at the beginning of December, and so that might be also a good time for us to meet and chat and build some more of the connections. But as Travis said, there's like just an amazing number of places where we can and should keep finding ways to connect. I'll also say on the workforce innovation work, thinking about what teachers' lives are like, getting their experiences, understanding the challenges to doing things differently. That's a project that's just starting up, and I think has natural overlap with the next education workforce work that you guys are doing.
Thank you. That's fabulous. It sounds like already there are collaborations brewing. It would be great for us to know, I'm sure your in-person retreat will be packed with other things, but it would be great if you could share the schedule with us, have Robbins share the schedule, so we could see if there might be opportunities, even for another kind of brown bag or something like that, to help pull more folks in, and students as well, into these conversations. So thanks for sharing that too. any final comments you'd like to make, or anyone, before we wrap up the session today? I feel like we've covered so many topics. My head is sort of spinning in terms of trying to summarize everything. So I don't think I'll try to do that. But
yeah, I think David had to leave. I was hoping David Garcia would have jumped in with some thoughts and comments as well, because he's been very intimately involved with speaking with policymakers, standing for governor himself, of course. So he sort of understands the landscape in ways that, is always, whenever I have a conversation with him, it's always insightful, opens my eyes to perspectives that I would not have considered otherwise. So.
Absolutely. Yes. One last thing I would do though, Travis, Stephen, and other folks at SERPI, please feel free to join us for any of our Justin hours. I'm thrilled to know that you're doing your own. I think maybe Punya and I should drop in and see what yours are like. It would be fun to hear your version of this, but please feel free to.
So actually I have a question about that, Travis. I mean, I don't know if you have been getting these emails. If you have not, we should add you to the list. So that's a lapse on our part, because this is an easy way to just drop into a conversation, just listen in, hear about what faculty here are doing. And if you think that your sessions are open to ASU faculty and doc students, if you could share that with us, we will just put it in a newsletter. There might be individuals who might, as we work towards, SERPI and MLFTC have been together since just February. It's not, we haven't even shared a birthday yet, right? So, but I think these are just some ways that we can bring the two communities together at sort of this, at the level of ideas and research. And that's what this whole, that's what we are all about at some level, right?
Yeah, so I think one thing I want to say on that is that one of the reasons we made this move to ASU and why we were excited to do so was because of all these opportunities for collaboration. Frankly, at the University of Washington, we were often on an island, and we were not always collaborating with folks at the ed school or in the policy school. We kind of bounced around institutional homes. And so having all of these opportunities and this openness is something that we need to build some more muscle, frankly, to support at the level that we want. So I think certainly inviting you all to our sessions and vice versa is something we want to do. I don't know that I've been getting the notifications about these, and so maybe we can follow up offline and rectify that.
You haven't, because that's a lapse on our part. That's what I mean by these blind spots, right? So we send this, we try to be as inclusive as possible, but guess what? We just completely forgot to share this with you. I'll be honest, right? And so apologies for that. And then we'll make sure that you're added to the list. And you'll see we have a couple coming up with journal editors around this data policy. I really think that I will send that email out to you guys, because that will, now that you're a part of ASU, that will have implications for the work you do and your input. It's not fully fleshed out yet. It's not final. So this is the right time to raise any red flags or concerns or objections, because I'm not sure that the people who created that first draft truly got it, right? So I think that's really important. So thank you for that.
Yeah, maybe we can.
That's great. And let's definitely continue to invest in building up some connective tissue so that we can stay connected as many ways as possible.
Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect way to end. We're right at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much, Travis and Stephen, for joining us again. It was a wonderful conversation. Thanks to everyone else who joined today, and we look forward to seeing you next week for our discussion with journal editors. So take care and have a great weekend.